So we will get that started. Okay. Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm, hmm? Oh. Thank you for joining us today. Sorry, I heard something. I'm like, oh, is that a question? Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I am Quinn Walcott. I'm the Business and Program Manager at the Summit Historical Society. We are a member organization, so we are supported by you. We are so happy to have Mary Ellen Gilliland here today. She is a longtime resident of Summit County and also a well-known author in the area and also a researcher as well. So we're so happy for her to be here today to talk about women of history in Summit County. Now, this presentation will be probably about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have questions at the end. Please, if you do have your camera on or thinking about having your camera on, we would love to see your lovely faces. But if you could mute that mic, that would be also wonderful as well. Now, this program is sponsored by Sarah Barkley from Slifer Smith in Frampton, and her information will be at the end of the program if you would like to get in contact with her. Now, without further ado, I would like to give it over to Mary Ellen Gilliland.
Thank you, Quinn. And I wanted to thank Sally Queen, and she's here with her husband today, and thank Quinn as well, both of them for hosting this. Quinn for doing the detail, and for Sally for being the spark plug who initiates so many of these programs. So I just wanted to talk to you today about Summit County Women of History, and to soberly warn you that well-behaved women didn't make it into the annals of history. It was more of those who had a behavior problem that made it in. But they also made it fun. So just for fun, I have a little quote that I like to begin with, and that is that across the stage of Summit County in the old days, there marched a parade of characters. And they were, first of all, the prospector, but right on his heels, the claim jumper, and in his dust, the gambler, and behind him, the shyster lawyer, and then the shady lady, and then the con artist, scoundrels, bounders, rascals, and reprobates. Now, this is fun because there were many honest and upright and righteous people. But I do like to say that although there was a parade of saints and sinners, it's a little hard for us to find the saints. One of them being Father John Lewis Dyer, our famous snowshoe itinerant who is pictured in stained glass in the Colorado State Capitol. But among the women, there were many fine examples of pioneer mothers and stellar characters and women of virtue. So we're going to look at those, but we'll also look at a couple of shady ladies just to shock your sensibilities. I'm sure you will be somewhat shocked. So we're going to proceed. But I just wanted to give a few words about early women in general before we start. And to say that the women who won the West learned that the Rocky Mountains meant both promise and privation. Promise to some, privation to others. And I think the promise was that, especially among the young and the unattached, that they found the freedom from society's restrictions. They didn't have to sit in the parlor anymore with the finger crooked holding the china teacup and wearing a corset which made them feel they needed to gasp for breath. But instead, they could ride bareback across a field with their hair streaming behind them. And an example of that is my dear friend, Edna Durkham. Edna, when she was 65 years old, was world champion women's slalom racer. This is a world champion, not just US or anything else. But when Edna was a little girl, her mother and her grandmother and her aunties forbid her to run. Edna, is a born athlete. She and Max founded Arapahoe Basin, and Max was very much an initiator of Keystone, and she was a skier from the get-go once she met Max back in Pennsylvania. But until then, she grew up in a small town, Clarinda, Minnesota, and she was not allowed to run, and she was not allowed to get her shoes dirty or her skirts dusty. So for her to get out of that and get into the West where things were free is a good example of the young women who came West. Also, among the young women, the marrieds, when they were just starting to begin to have children, and they needed the grandmas and the aunties and the mamas so badly as a support system. Their husbands, of course, were young men who were ready to test their mettle against the challenges that the West could throw to them and test their strength and their ability to overcome. But the women were nesting at that point, the young ones, and needed their families. So in that case, it was a lonely life in a lonely land for some of them, and a experience of privation. But they're wonderful, simple symbols of what women can do in the very earliest of days. The very first woman to come over the pass, cross the Continental Divide, and come into Summit County was a single lady. Well, she wasn't single, but she was the lone lady in a party of 29 prospectors. She was the one woman, and she was married. Her name was Mrs. Marksberry, and she came with this party seeking gold in 1859. And that same party of 29 wintered over. They wanted to be the first when the snow melted, while the others were up on the pass post holing and ditching their equipment because the snow was still so deep in May. They would be here getting the gold. So they decided to winter over in what was called Fort Mary B, probably for Mrs. Marksberry. And they built that in the general area of where City Market is in Breckenridge. And it was a log fort, a big square fort of green logs. And it was for defense against the wild Indians, but the Utes, who were camped about 15 miles down the Blue, were completely at ease with them. They'd never bothered them at all. And so they wintered there, but of course you have to think there was no mail, no radio, no TV, no internet, no access even, because the snow piled up deeper and deeper and deeper. And for them to get out was almost impossible until two Norwegians, Bals and Christian Weaver, cut down some spruce trees and sawed boards, steamed up the tips, and put some long leather thongs on there for bindings, and put themselves on skis in February of 1860. The year had turned, and they were the first ever to discover gold on the western slope of Colorado. Breckenridge later became the first town on the western slope, and their gold discovery was the first gold strike on the western slope in February of 1860. So a few people got out. Probably not Mrs. Marksberry, which shows what a stalwart soul she was to last it out. Another very early woman in Summit County was Mrs. Silverthorne. And Mrs. Silverthorne was beloved by the miners. She was kind of a mother figure and we have to remember that this was pretty much an all-male society in those very early years. Women started coming and staying full-time in 1879 during the lode mining rush. But this was the early rush, the placer mining rush or the surface mining rush, where a gold pan alongside the creek would yield you nuggets when you swirled it with the sands and swirled the water off. That's placer mining. And so this first gold rush was placer mining. And the women came with that second rush almost 20 years later. So, but Mrs. Silverthorne, her children saw Indians scalping whites along the wagon train across the Great American Desert, what they called it, and her daughters witnessed a hanging in Denver, but they grew up to be unflappable adults. And another very early woman, Almeda Peabody, who lived in Gold Run Gulch on the site of that discovery of gold that I told you about, the two Norwegians that fashioned the skis out of the spruce boards. It was interesting because Almeda had golden wavy tresses, she was kind of like Rapunzel, let down your long hair. I don't know if you remember that very old nursery verse, but she was a beautiful young girl, and she came out to a sister brother, Leland Peabody, and Colorado. And by the way, I'm going to say Indian. If I were talking about Native Americans today, I would call them Native Americans. But historians normally use the terms that were used at the time they're writing. So I will say Indians because that's what they were called at the time. So an Indian named Colorado, who was slightly overweight, 350 pounds at his glorious peak, took a very great shining toward Almeda Peabody, and he used to stick his head through the window of the log cabin where she lived and cooked for the miners on the Peabody Placer up in Gold Run Gulch, and he'd say, "I want that squaw." And her brother would say, "Oh, no, lazy squaw, no good squaw," But she had to endure that. And then during a scare, when in South Park there was a cabin that was attacked, apparently by the Utes. The Utes normally were very friendly and open-handed to the whites, but a cabin that was attacked and the whole place emptied out. It was like, a Ute scare. But she was 9 months pregnant, and so Almeda gave birth with just another person watching over her, and not in any way a midwife or any medical help. So she was a very strong early woman. Just running back to Mrs. Silverthorne, she was wife of Judge Marshall Silverthorne, who was judge of the miners' court. As I said, she was the mother of the camp. And she went back like most women did. If there were any women in the early days, they went back for the winters. And so when she returned in the spring, and they would walk over Boreas Pass because the snow formed a crust like it's forming right now, a good crust that they could walk on. And the miners would walk up the pass and meet her at the summit and bring her down on a sled because they really liked her. She baked pies and sold them in the hotel, the Silverthorne Hotel that she and her husband ran, was the post office. So when the miners came down from the camps in the gulches to get their mail, they would buy pies from her. And so that was wonderful. They never got fresh pies, and so that was great. And she was also using her oven after she baked the pies to dry gold nuggets. And so one of the miners, when she went back to get the mail, saw the gold nuggets drying over on the baking rack and picked a big one and put it in his shirt. And there was this horrible scream because those nuggets were still very hot from being refined a bit in the fire. And so he got a glorious burn, but he didn't get his mail that day. So anyway, the mountain women were written about by one of the people that I think is a wonderful example of Summit County women. This is Belle Turnbull when she was a young woman. She was a poet, and a poet especially of the 10 Mile Range. And she has a book called The 10 Mile Range. And I'm going to read just her poem on mountain women because I think it's so great. And she uses a character, Mr. Probus, sometimes to make comments in her poems. So Mr. Probus is speaking here. God love these mountain women anyway, said Mr. Probus. Not to say they're fair or sleek with oils, for wood smoke in the hair and sagebrush on the fingers every day are toughening perfumes. And the sunstreams flay to dainty flesh. But what remains is rare, like mountain honey to a mountain bear. He finds relish in a rough bouquet. Days when their wash is drying, off they'll go and fish the beaver ponds. Hell or high water, they'll wade the sloughs in sunburnt calico, playing a trout like some old sea king's daughter. Hell and high water women. Steady now. Not all of them, he said. One, anyhow. I think maybe his wife was there and he's saying, well, wait a minute, I don't mean you here. But I don't figure out the last line. But I just think her poems are so incredible. And I'm going to read another one later, but one of her expressions that I love is the jag, she calls it, piercing the sky, the 10 mile. And there's a picture on the cover of the Summit Daily magazine newspaper today. And it shows some of those jagged peaks in the 10 mile. And that's just what she was talking about. She says, when a jagged tooth bites the sky. And I think that is very colorful. And I really love her. So we've talked a little bit about mountain women. And I'd like to get into individual stories now about those mountain women. And the first one that I'd like to do is Mabel Gore. She's one of my favorites because Mabel Gore, although she was 5 feet tall or just a little short of that, and she weighed 100 pounds, she was a fireball. And so she was fearless in the face of danger and challenge, and proved that. She was a wife and mother, but she had the instinct to act in the face of crisis. This is what we want from a little teeny lady. Once when she was on the train from Breckenridge, taking her blind mother-in-law to San Francisco to see her family, and she had her baby son and her toddler daughter, Zoe. They were just leaving Breckenridge and they were out coming down the Blue and, going up, going toward Boreas Pass. A drunk stumbled into the car and he was spewing obscenities and he was staggering down the aisle. And the conductor came through the door and he ordered the drunk to sit down and be quiet. And so the drunk backs up against the chair that the blind grandmother and Mabel Gore were sitting in. He's against the back of the door and he pulls a gun on the conductor. Well, Mabel, at the ready, leaps from her seat and plunks herself down on the next red plush seat, grabs the guy by the neck and jams her thumb into his windpipe and thus disables him. And so the conductor cries, "Lady, hold on, I'm going to get out." So he goes and gets the brakeman and they come in and they disarm this guy. And Mabel, of course, settles down with her baby and her toddler and her blind grandmother to enjoy the rest of the ride. So, yeah, he said, "For God's sake, lady, hold tight." But Mabel was just good for any kind of circumstance. And in one case, when Zoe, who was just a toddler on that train, was 16 years old. She was hosting the Daughters of St. John, and they were in a sewing circle doing their stitchery and their embroidery while Agnes Minor read from the scriptures from the Holy Bible. And so this is a prim association of young women, probably members of Sisters Mustard Seeds, which was an organization for young women. And they were having their circle in the parlor of the Robert Gore house. And Mabel, of course, was the wife of Robert Gore. He was the dredge master for the Reliance Dredge, a famous dredge. So again, we have an inebriate, and he had asked directions to the red light district up on French Street. But when he got there, instead of turning left on French, he turned right and saw the lights on the porch of the Gore home. And so Zoe hears his footsteps coming up the stairs and believes it's the footsteps of her father, Robert Gore, who was coming home late that day because it was a Friday and they were cleaning up gold on the dredge. That means picking up all the gold, forming it into gold bars, and getting it ready to ship on the railroad to the bank in Denver. So Zoe runs to the door and opens it, and this drunk lurches in, grabs her by the waist, and yells, "I'll take you, Katie." Well, Mabel, who was in the kitchen reading her fashion magazine of the day, roars out of the kitchen holding it. And this is the Delineator magazine, like the Godey's ladies book. It's about this thick. And she rolls it up and she begins to pummel this guy right and left. He's a little unsteady on his feet, driving him across the parlor into the entry and out the front door. He dissolves in kind of a mess on the front porch. Mabel picks up the old-fashioned telephone, gets the operator, calls Sheriff Detweiler, Jerry Detweiler, and he comes over. And just as Robert Gore came in the back door, the sheriff showed up at the front door, and together they disarmed this guy who was wielding a gun. So this is another amazing story about Summit County women. And I really like Mabel because she emerges from the kitchen, ready for bear, armed for bear with her Delineator magazine. And then when it's, while the sheriff's on his way, she makes hot chocolate and warms cookies for the girls in the parlor to settle them down. So she lived till 1970, and she died at age 98 in Breckenridge. And I think she is a wonderful example of early day women. Now, a less, what would you say, perfect example of an old time woman was Dixie. Dixie's real name was Ada Smith. She lived in Montezuma, and she was the madam in Montezuma. And so she rode the boom and bust cycle of the mining, which is, the mining culture had its high points and its serious dips. So in 1893, for example, when the Sherman Silver Purchase Act was passed by Congress and it demonetized silver, Montezuma was on its economic knees. But in 1900, after technology in mining helped extract silver in a more efficient way, and the silver crisis was over, then Montezuma led the nation in silver production. Well, in the early days around 1893, when things were very bad, Dixie, who was our local soiled dove, flew solo. But after 1900, she had a house full of soiled doves, red light ladies. And so she was a character Dixie, and she wore gaudy clothes. You know, women dressed when they went out, they dressed in black, brown, or dove gray. Dixie had blaze orange scarves to tie down her big picture hats, and she wore crimson and bright yellow, and just broke all the laws of proper decorum for ladies' dress. She loved baseball. She was a big fan, and I'm sure she always told herself that she would zipper her lip when she went to the game, because she would sit down in the stands and the men were playing baseball, and every one of our 33 towns, pretty much everybody had a baseball team. This was big. And just when bicycling came in, baseball, some of those things. So anyway, she goes and sits down in the stands, and she's gonna be quiet. She's gonna behave herself. But being such an avid fan, she simply couldn't restrain herself. And when things got exciting, a stream of blue language would flow from her at the top of her lungs, blaring. And the matrons with their children had to get up and move and sit on the rocks around the side of the baseball field while Dixie was alone in the stands rooting for her team in language that would probably turn your ears red. So she was quite a character too. And Elizabeth Rice Roller, who wrote about her, and Elizabeth's father ran a store in Montezuma, a grocery store. She remembered that she was ushered into the back room when Dixie came in. She couldn't be in the same room with Dixie, but she did hear through the curtain that Dixie used coupons. They had them back then too, and she would buy can after can of tinned milk to feed to the town's stray cats. And she had a very soft heart. And during lean years later, and 100 years ago, we had an epidemic in Summit County, as did across the globe. Pandemic is a word they didn't use, but it was the Spanish influenza. And mine carts and and wagons came out of the ghost town, the mine camps that later became ghost towns, carrying bodies. And the Summit County Journal, instead of printing the news on the front page, simply printed obituaries. It was such a terrible time. And by then, Dixie was pretty much, Elizabeth said she had a face like a wrinkled apple. And she was a wizened older lady, but she brought soup to the miners who were high in the hills, and she cared for her former patrons from her heyday in Montezuma. And from being shunned in those early days, she finally, in her latter years, wormed her way into the hearts of the people of Montezuma. So that is another story that I really enjoy, and I hope you did too. Another of our wonderful characters who has been so beautifully covered by the Summit Historical Society is Lula Myers. But I just like to mention her because I am so in love with her. She's so cute. And she came to Frisco as a schoolmarm in 1902. And the school was located in today's Frisco Historic Museum. But that was the schoolhouse. It was built as a saloon and later taken over and used as a schoolhouse, and still had a wine cellar in the basement for many years. She married Demp Myers, who was a miner and son of the very flagrant mining mogul James Havens Myers. And they had a lot of fun together. They rode up to the dances either at Univa Lake or up to Kokomo in the 10 Mile Canyon, pumping a rail car to get there. And sometimes when on the way back, when the car got going too fast to Frisco, the men would have to put out their patent leather dancing shoes and try and drag their feet, shred their shoes, coming down the hill to try and slow down the pump car. but they had a good time, and they were happy together. And they and when Dimp wasn't mining, he had a draying business. He had a wagon and the big workhorses, and he hauled ore and things like that. Well, he got a call from the Pennsylvania mine one January night when it was way below zero. And they said, there's a body up here. Old Jake bit the dust. And will you come up and get the body and take it down to Dillon? So, so Lula decided to accompany Dimp, and they sang their way up just to keep themselves happy and warm, picked up this body, which was stiff as a board by then, and bounced back down that road through Peru Creek. And it's not a good road now, and it was a worse road then. And the body, unknown to them, while they were singing all their favorite songs at the top of their lungs and looking at the stars and the moon, the body, that rigor mortis ridden body, was bouncing up and down in the back. Well, when they got to Dillon at like maybe 4 a.m, they went to unload old Jake, and he wasn't there. And of course, this was a sacred duty to go up and get this body. So they had to go all the way up. And Lula told our friend Edna Durkham that they were much more sober and silent on their trip to retrieve Jake. But they found his body and brought him back to Dillon. And of course, Edna Durkham also told me that in later years, when she and her husband and their 2 little children lived at the Alhambra cabin before they bought Ski Tip Lodge, which they ran for many years, that Lula was just always hovering. If they were on the phone, she'd pick up to make sure everything was okay, because they had party lines. And so she'd pick up and she'd be, talking or eating an apple or something, listening to them on the phone, but always out of concern. And so when they called the doctor one time because Rolf, their son, was ill, she jumped in her truck. She was driving then, and she jumped in her truck, and no more horse and carriage, and drove. And she was a terrible driver, so she drove at a deafening roar of the motor, high speed, and jammed on the brakes at the very last minute and nearly hit the cabin wall. But she stopped, and she comes roaring in. And so that's what kind of a driver she was, Lula. And so Edna said that when it came time, things got more and more civilized, and Lula had to get a driver's license, which Edna felt was going to be completely impossible, knowing the quirks of her driving habits and abilities. And so she went to Breckenridge, and Edna cautioned her, coached her and said, now there's a stop sign now in Breckenridge. There's a stop sign at Main Street in Lincoln, and you need to stop. Okay, and you need to do this and that. So Lula went to Breckenridge, and she came back, and she was disconsolate. She was down in the mouth. And Edna said, what happened? Did you stop at that stop sign? And Lula said, "'Twarn't nothing coming." So she didn't stop, and she failed her driver's test. This did not in any way diminish her activity as a driver. It just simply meant she didn't have a license. So Lula was married to a miner, and it was said that this was the reason why the school board in Frisco nailed the door of the school shut at one time. I think it was because one of the members of the school board, this crusty old guy, was jealous that she was being courted by a miner as handsome as Dimp, whom she eventually married. But there was some trouble there. And the life of a wife of a miner was again pictured by Val Turnbull in a poem, and I wanted to read that to you. And it's called Mrs. Ike Said. So Ike was the miner, and if you were the wife of a miner, you could be Mrs. Ike or Mrs. Jake or Mrs. Joe. So this is Mrs. Ike said, "Oh, I have had my dreamings," Mrs. Ike said, viewing the gray, jagged teeth, round the spring head, queenly as an eagle. "I thought to marry some great gold cockerel, lord like, the way a raw girl fancies. By the Lord Harry," her laugh enriched the valley, "I must pick Ike, hard set as bedrock, and born mine poor." She plucked a green gentian, shook out a bee, gazed as in crystal. Afternoon wore blue along the valley. "Holes," said she. About that time a jagged tooth bit on the sun. "Holes the depths of mountains, on death's soup bone. Oh, but God love him and lock my tongue." "Us be getting home, dear," Mrs. Ike said. "Ike is coming off the hill. I have to set bread." Just a little window into the world of the wife of a miner. So the next person we're going to look at is Big May Nicholson. And May was, she was big. She was the madam in old time Breckenridge. She ran an establishment, which at that time, the red light district was west of the river and west of the railroad in Breckenridge, and no longer up on French Street. And she ran the a group of the ladies of the night who operated next door to a very large mill. So the customers were close at hand. And May, here's a picture, and this is my book, Rascals, Scoundrels, and No Goods. And this is a picture of May. And I know it's not good, but you can kind of get a look at her. Her horse has silver studs, silver saddles, silver spurs, everything. And she's all decked out. And she used to lead the No Man's Land parade in Breckenridge when she was older. But she ran this house of ill repute until around 1910, when mining began to run out and dry up. And not that it ended right then, because gold dredging was certainly launched in 1905, but that it only used a few employees, and there were some big mines running, but the number of prospectors really dwindled, and many moved down the Blue to ranch on open land there. May, in her turn, took her considerable savings out of the Bank of Breckenridge. We can still see that across from the Summit County Courthouse on Lincoln Street, and a beautiful old bank building. And she decided to start a dairy business. She would raise dairy cows on a ranch down the Blue. Today, if you know the Raven Golf Course, that area was her ranch. I'm familiar with it because I cross-country ski there. And May went from milking traveling salesmen and miners and errant husbands to producing and selling ranch milk. And she would deliver to milk customers on nearby ranches. And she herded dairy cows and hoisted milk cans, which were heavy, and it wasn't easy work. And when customers called her, she just was perfectly transparent. She said, "Look, I used to run a whorehouse in Breckenridge. If that bothers you, you can get your milk someplace else." But most of the customers overlooked her shady past and ordered milk from her. And she had another way of spending cash. And she was very good with horses. She could train a horse to do anything. That's why she led the no man's land parades, because her horses did the fancy tricks. They would, climb up a little stairway and throw their heads back and do all sorts of things. And so she was excellent with horses, a great horsewoman. And so she decided to lead trips up to the Salmon Lakes above the ranch. And this is in that beautiful bowl below the Thorn, that Zodiac Ridge that you can see in the gore from Silverthorne. And so the lakes up there were just alive with fish. And so she'd get these guys from Denver, organize a group, and she'd lead them up there on horseback and wrangle the horses and take care of them, feed them and everything. And they could fish and stay overnight. And she had tents and stuff. Anyway, her language, just kind of like Dixie, her language was so blue that even these guys couldn't handle it. So she hired a young man who was my source for all this information on May Nicholson. And he was 17 when he first came and knocked on her door. He was with a survey crew, and none of the guys wanted to knock on May Nicholson's door of the ranch house. And so they sent this kid up there that was working with him. And he got to know her and got to love her. And when he was going to get married, he brought his young bride-to-be to see if May approved of her before they got married. So he said, I thought a great deal of May because she was honest and sensitive. That's what he told me. She was a real lady. She was a real tough lady, his wife Jane added. So stories about May. And also, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Susan Badger, who was the silk stocking pioneer. She wasn't rough around the edges. She came from a wealthy family in Colorado Springs. I think in the East. But she arrived in Colorado Springs at age 16 on a stretcher because she had TB so seriously. And so many people, my husband's parents, their families came because of tuberculosis. The dry air in Colorado was supposed to be a healing factor. And so they came, and her fiance had already died, and she grieved him all of her life and didn't marry. She lived in Colorado Springs, and she eventually moved up to Summit County and became county welfare director out of Breckenridge. But she was the kind that wore a hat. She wouldn't go out without a hat. She was a lady, and she had tea parties, and she had a very prim and sociable life. She had a convertible car, and she always had a little Scotty dog that she built a booster seat in the back so he could see out when they rumbled around Summit County. But in her side life, she played a mean game of poker, and she played with the men in Frisco, and she smoked in secret, of course, and she drank whiskey liberally. And so she was just a step away from the proper lady that she began as. And she, of course, she still loved her fiance who passed away, and even gave her engagement ring to one of the ladies in Frisco before she died. But she said, the more I see of men, the more I love my Scotty dog. So she took care of those needing welfare in Summit County. And when a poor couple had their baby die, she took her best white satin pajamas and lined a basket to make a baby casket. So she was a very well-loved lady in old-time Frisco. So we're getting to 5:15, and I think we said we would be have a little time for question and answers. So if anybody would like to ask a question, I will do my level best to give you an answer. Any question on Summit County history or Summit County women? Anything you want to know?
Mary Ellen, Bruce Queen, in
Yeah.
going through the 1905 warrants for salaries paid in the county,
Yeah.
we ran across the name Lulu Buffington,
Yeah, she was
Superintendent of
schools. Mhm.
from Kokomo.
Yes.
But
Mhm.
what do you know of Lulu?
Well, I know that Lula was the superintendent of schools when Lula Osborne at that time, who became Lula Myers, was having the trouble in Frisco. And Lula, knowing her all of her life, was a tenderhearted, kind person. And she would have loved her students. And she had some students, if you look at her class list, some students that had to be challenged, you know. Today they would be in a special ed program. And then she had the big boys in her class who might, in some cases, be bigger than her. Although Lula is a tough little gal, and you know, she had the big pompadour hairdo around the turn of the century and all that, but she always wore heavy miner's boots so she could let you have it if she needed to under her pretty skirts. You know, she had those miner's boots on. So Lula ran a muck with the school board, and I think it was one of the school board members. This is my own opinion because we don't have any facts to prove it. But he was, I think, very much in love with sweet Lula. And by the way, if you ski at Keystone, the Keystone Run school marm is named after Lula. And my little grandson was up last week during spring break and got to ski that with a couple of his little buddies. So that was nice. But anyway, Lula ran amok, and I think it was mostly the stirring of trouble by this one old codger that lived up in the 10 Mile Canyon that took a shine to her. And Lula Buffington was the superintendent of schools. But she was married to Mark, let's see, what was his name? She was married during the time of a trial because Lula and Demp sued the school board. And I think Sally and Quinn probably know a lot about this. But the attorney was married to Lulu Buffington. And the trial got, kind of thrown askew by that. So there was no good outcome for Lula and Demp. But anyway, they went on to live in Summit County. They had a beautiful daughter. She had the wonderful house that adjoins the Summit Historical Society Museum on the museum property, and they filled that with her geraniums and the music from the piano, and all of that end of Summit County would come to their house, which was located at today's River Run base at Keystone, and they would sing and dance and enjoy the joy of the couple Demp and Lula.
We do have a few questions that we've got into the chat. Our first one is from Barb. It says, about where was the house of ill repute west of river and west of railroad? There we go.
Yeah.
Would it have been up Ski Hill Road?
No, it would not. It was really in the flats. It would have been in Breckenridge, today's present day Breckenridge, but on that other side, the west side of the river, which at that time was not a great place to be at night. And so it was not the proper place of Breckenridge. And that's where her operation, her headquarters was for her very profitable business.
The Silverthorne.
Okay, our next question is from Jean. And she says, did Mrs. M.
Mark
Sperry, there we go.
Sperry?
Mrs. M. Sperry stay in the Breckenridge area after 1860?
Yes, and she had the first child born in Breckenridge, and she called him Summit Marksbury, and he turned out to be a runner, a cross-country runner who won awards around the country. Probably because he had the lungs for high altitude, and he could outrun anybody out on the low altitude running fields. So yes, she stayed.
Wonderful. We have another question from Greg and Marguerite. Please tell us about Adrian's Pleasure Palace before it became the Hearthstone.
The Hearthstone. Okay. Let me think now.
You moved up here, Mary Ellen. Hearthstone 40 years ago was Andrea's Pleasure Palace, and it had the velvet on the walls, but it's not the side you're saying the houses were. It was still a restaurant then, back in the mid-70s.
It was. And I'm just having a little memory loss here about the Hearthstone. I think it was Chris Kaiser's house that I'm trying to remember. It was somebody's house. And let me be thinking about that. Let me take another question and start looking from Mrs. Kaiser. There's a story about her in the Breckenridge book, and we'll find out where her house was. So can I take another question while we're doing that? We have another.
Mary Ellen, hi. I'm Melanie Wojtash. I wanted to show you, I happen to have this little sign.
Yeah.
And I thought
Yeah.
it was totally perfect for the beginning of your lecture.
Fun. We're, well-behaved women rarely make history. Is that what
Rarely make history.
So-
I wanted to share that with you.
Yeah, that is so fun. Yeah, I know the Hearthstone, but somehow memory is failing me right now. But I think it was, let's see, here's Chris Kaiser in here. So let's just see. Okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing it right away.
I think it sounds like a great research project, Mary Ellen, don't you think?
Well, I know that I know it. I just can't remember it.
Well, we'll help report in. This is Sally Queen, and I've looked through the clothing collection at the Summit Historical Society, and we do have Susan Badger clothing. So thank you so much for enlightening me of what I'm looking at from the clothing perspective.
Yeah. Well, she would have, when she went out during the day, she would have worn a hat and a proper dress and white gloves or something like that, But at night, she let down her hair and played poker and drank whiskey.
I'm looking for both outfits.
Yeah.
I don't think we have a hat, though, I'm sorry to say.
Okay. Well, she probably wore it out because she wore it all the time.
I wish we did.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just looking at it. Just seems like it was Chris Kaiser's home, but I cannot remember. But Chris Kaiser opened Kaiser's Market in 1904, Breckenridge, and he had a big, beautiful home. Yeah, I think that's it, because I think it is Kaiser's home. And Mrs. Kaiser kept house, and she prided herself on washing her wood floors in milk. Now, I can't see that unless they were very carefully rinsed, because milk sours, and it would have made, but anyway, this was a mark of her distinction as a homemaker and housekeeper. And she always kept a cow, Mrs. Kaiser's cow, during the 1898-99 winter, the winter of the big snow. the cow was in the barn, and she worked every day to get that barn door open with the huge drifts of snow and milk that cow. And one day she went in and the cow was missing. And she, oh my gosh. Well, Chris Kaiser, because supplies had run out in the grocery store, had by midnight purloining, had gotten the cow out and taken it over. And before she woke up in the morning, had it butchered and in the meat counter. And of course, she was very, very angry. So instead, she got a goat for milk and she kept it under her eye all the time in case he would take it. And one day, when she bent over her laundry basket to hang wash on the line, the goat butted her full force in the back end and sent her head over heels 2 or 3 times with her skirts, petticoats displayed, and a total disarray that I'm sure passing neighbors on Ridge Street might have noticed.
Good story.
Yeah.
Story.
Any other questions? Well, I hope you've enjoyed today. And I would just like to say that the contribution that women made to Summit County in the early days, there were the hurdy-gurdy girls, the dance hall girls, which I didn't get to talk about, and women that would spend the summers. But in 1879, they came to stay. And that's when they initiated schools, churches, musical concerts, libraries. They brought society and culture to Breckenridge in those days following 1879. The women were responsible for that. So we have to thank them for our more civilized lifestyle that ensued after their permanent year-round arrival.
Well, thank you, Mary Ellen. And if anyone has questions that come up after the fact, after we've closed out, you're more than welcome to send them my way, and I will send them to Mary Ellen and get those answers for you. But let me see if I can try to pull this up since it's being a little on the difficult side.
Thank you for the thank yous in the chat.
Thanks so much. It was wonderful.
Good. I'm so glad that you enjoyed it.
Now, thank you everyone for coming. We definitely enjoy all of your friendly faces, and I see a lot of you have been here before, so thank you for coming again, and I hope that you've been really enjoying our speaker series and our speakers that we've been having over the past 2021 year. So thank you, and thank you, Mary Ellen. You are always wonderful and just a delight to listen to, and I'm sure everyone else feels very similarly.
Thank you, Quinn.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you who are joining us today are not already a member, please consider becoming a member. As membership, we are a membership organization, so membership is important to us in doing what we're doing and putting on programs such as these. Of course, today's sponsor was Sarah Barkley, and this is her information if you are looking for a place. She probably would love to help you with that. Of course, thank you for joining. We also have our links for if you would like to become a member. And then also making a donation as well. Since we love on Zoom, and it will be an interview with Alan Rice. So that will be, there we go. Okay, so that will be a wonderful interview, and he'll be talking about his memories of living on the Rice Family Ranch, which is currently Summit Cove. So that will be a nice little into Ranch Month. which will be this upcoming April month. So thank you so much for joining us, Gabrielle.
Bye-bye, and thank you for having me.
Take care. Bye.